My name is Paul Howard-Jones. It's really nice to be here today to talk to you about two sides of the same coin, which is essentially the effects of technology on the brain. But in particular, I would like to focus on games and the brain as being potentially a special influence. If you're writing notes, I would suggest that you just take down this web address. There's lots of nice free stuff on there. This is our network, our research network. We do basic fundamental neuroscience using neuroimaging. We also do bridging studies between the brain scanner and the classroom. And we're also interested in developing classroom practice, which is something else again. We do public communication, such as this, and we consult with teachers, because the debate about neuroscience and education is gaining a lot of interest, and increasingly neuroscience is impacting on educational thinking. I sometimes worry that educators are actually being left out of that debate. So an important role for us is to make sure that we consult with teachers, and in that way we'll be able to more effectively present their views to government. My entry point for this presentation are some headlines that have been appearing recently about the way in which we believe technology, or we are worried that technology might be influencing us. The idea that it's turning into our 21st century addiction, that Facebook is infantilizing our brains, Google is degrading our intelligence. There's this idea that technology is, in a sense, we're hoovering up all this stuff that we don't really know what's doing to our system. It was in the light of that I was pleased when the Nominate Trust asked me to review the impact of digital technology on human well-being, focusing particularly on the internet, but a wide range of applications within that. And I think Dan Such is here today, and he might have brought along some copies of this report. So he's over there, the man with the beard. Put your hand up. Put your hand up, Dan, so in case you're interested in picking one up, so you're going to get a scrum later. So let's deal with a few of these issues to start off with. First of all, can Google rewire the brain? Well, Gary Small and his colleagues did a very interesting study. They looked at the difference in brain activation when people were Googling compared with when they were reading a book. And you can see that amongst naive users, in the left-hand picture, we can see there's some increase in brain activity in the visual cortex. Perhaps these people who don't know how to use Google are doing a little bit more visual searching on the screen, perhaps, I don't know, but certainly a bit of increase in visual activity there. But amongst experienced users, we see as a great increase in activity in many wide-ranging areas of the cortex. So it's clear that experience with Google changes the way that your brain functions when you're presented with Google. So it seems fairly clear evidence that Google is rewiring our brains. The issue is really whether we should worry about that, because the brain is plastic, and any environmental experience, anything that you do which is memorable, must involve some rewiring of the brain for you to be able to remember it. Memory has a biological correlate. It must do. And what we see when we look at learning in the brain is that it involves changes in neural connectivity, that the synapses change their efficiency between the neurons, the connections change their efficiency. We also see shifts in regional activity. So in this case, for example, this is what happens when adults practice complex multiplication. We see in some areas, on the left-hand side, there is a decrease in activity. So after training, when they're doing the multiplication, now we see that some frontal areas corresponding to working memory reduce their activation. Well, working memory is our ability to hold things in our attention at any one moment. And it's a bottleneck for learning. So when we're first learning anything new, there's a great burden on working memory. We have to remember all the things that the teacher told us, all the things that we did wrong last time. Perhaps we're wondering whether we should be looking at our friend's attempt over there, whatever. All these things are unnecessary things later on, because once we've learned how to do it, the processes become automatic. And what we see is that there is an increase in activity in some posterior parts of the brain. Now things are automatic. So there's a shift in activity from frontal to posterior regions. Now, when we look back at that, perhaps it's not so shocking that Google is rewiring our brains, because after all, these experienced users are likely to be using more search strategies. They know how to use Google. They've learned how to use Google. They're doing different things. They've moved on. They're making more complex decisions. They're thinking ahead. They're thinking about what associations might be good to put into it. they're not simply visually searching the page trying to work out what's going on. So the brain is plastic, and that's good news for all of us, but some brains are more plastic than others. And this is a picture of my little boy who's 5. At 4, he learnt to use a keyboard before he learnt to write. And the first thing, he's certainly one of our digital natives, I think. And interesting, the first thing he did once he was able to use the keyboard was to put his name into Google and Google himself. Like father, like son, perhaps. And then later on, add associations, so he didn't know many words, so I think the next one was Finn and poo, and see what that brought up. So, but certainly, because these children's brains are more plastic, we should be focusing these questions more on our younger generation. If there are changes that are unfortunate going on, they're more likely to be happening in the younger brains. And certainly our children are at the vanguard of this increase in our digital lifestyle. So will things such as Facebook be infantilizing our children's brains? Well, if you look at the 90s research, you might have cause for concern because internet use was associated with reduced social connectedness, poorer well-being. But if you think back to the 90s, those of you who can think back to the 90s, what technology was like then, when Windows 95 was just this rather edgy thing on the horizon, technology was very different. There were very few people, very few teenagers, for example, connected to the internet. If you were spending all your time on the internet, developing text-only web pages, you were probably having quite a dull time. Perhaps you were a special sort of a person. I can well believe that you might be socially isolated. On the other hand, recent research shows that, of course, half of our kids, that was in 2008, are using these types of sites. But we find that they're associated with a stimulation of teenage social connectedness and psychosocial well-being. There is a positive association there. But I think the important thing is, and that's, of course, because technology is so much a part of the world in which teenagers live, but I think the important thing is that it's also about how the technology is used. And what we find is that that positive connection actually breaks down once we look at children who are using it to create new friendships. So if social networks are being used mostly to support existing friendships, it's a positive benefit. It's children and individuals who are using it to make new friends that we can expect more negative outcomes. So the how technology is being used is absolutely central to this. And part of that is when you use it. Sleep being a classic area where technology can disrupt your well-being. Now, sleep helps you rest, but it's not just about rest. Sleep also helps you learn. There is a switch in your brain, a transmitter called acetylcholine, that actually switches your hippocampus, which is all to do with memory consolidation, from receiving information from the cortex, from the outer surface of the brain, switches it back at night so that, in fact, the information is flowing back to the cortex during slow-wave sleep. And that is helping you consolidate what you've come across and what you've encountered during the day. In fact, you can even see this in this study. I always find this slightly difficult looking at this, but apparently, in scientific terms, the top images are very similar to the bottom images. The top images are showing that sort of cortical activity during wakefulness, and these are, to some extent, reproduced at night when you're asleep as a result of this memory consolidation process. So if your sleep is being disrupted, your learning is being disrupted. That's the important point. And small bright screens actually may interrupt your sleep a little bit more than screens such as television, because they reduce melatonin secretion, which is part of that going to sleep process. And that may be why the teenagers, for example, who text after lights out are 4 times more likely to suffer daytime sleepiness. And that, of course, has a very direct knock-on effect to academic achievement. As well as that, as well as a lack of rest, it's also going to disturb your ability to remember information. And of course, this happens quite a lot. I mean, the picture on the left is my daughter, actually, and I find myself creeping in at night and doing these sort of night raids to make sure there's no little bright screens on. It's a very difficult thing to regulate because, of course, a teenager's mobile is actually biologically connected to them, and it is actually a travesty of human rights if you suggest that it should be turned off. So there's all sorts of social issues in trying to actually apply some of what we know about the effect of technology on the brain. This is a very interesting study, and we need more of this type of research. And I think you might be surprised by this, because I was. A group of 13 to 14-year-olds were given a choice of 3 different types of activity, and they were alternating, they weren't given a choice, sorry, they alternated these different activities on different evenings. So it was a within participant study. And on some evenings they were playing computer games, some evenings they were watching TV, and some evenings they weren't allowed to do either. Now, that took place between 6 and 7 p.m., so that seems to me like quite a reasonable time for children to be getting involved with technology. But what you see in the top graph is the percentage of this slow-wave sleep that occurred during the night. And you can see for the basal conditions, when there was no technology involved, they have the best percentage of slow-wave sleep. Television, next best. The worst condition is the computer game condition, even though, and there is a statistically significant difference, even though that was actually between 6 and 7 p.m. in the evening, which is quite interesting. And then if you look at the bottom graph, that shows you the percentage of memory loss they had for information that they came across, which could be homework, for example, immediately after that technology session. And they have the least memory loss in the basal condition, some significant memory loss in the television condition, but in the computer game condition, they have the worst memory loss. But overall, I would have to say from this review that I did for the Nominate Trust, my feeling was that there isn't really any evidence that digital technology has a special influence on the brain. Social network sites, for example, are to a very large extent an extension of our normal everyday social environment. And some of the problems you get in that environment, in the playground, such as bullying, occur in these virtual environments, but their causes, the factors that are involved, are very similar to the type of events that you see in the playground, and the type of guidance that these children need is also very similar. I found myself moving away from, as a parent, I found myself moving away from concerns about cyber safety, especially when you look at the statistics in America, where only 2% of crimes against children appear to be internet-related, and more towards these more mundane issues of digital hygiene, I would call them, which seems to be about, to a large extent, transferring our offline everyday wisdom that we have about bringing children up to the online environment. So it's a matter of choosing activities with obvious benefit, moderating those activities, making sure there's a variety of them, and the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrician guidelines of 2 hours total screen time a day seems to link very well to the research. And healthy scheduling in terms of time. Now, I say almost all respects, because I think there is one stimulus which stood out to me as being very different to any other type of technology with respect to its effect on the brain. And this was games, video games, and particularly action video games. How much you use technology is accepted as a health issue. The percentages estimated of internet addiction range from somewhere between 1.5 to 8.2%. But the interesting thing is what those people, those addicts, are actually doing. If they're adults, I'm ashamed to say it's pornography and illicit relationships. But if it's young people who are doing much better, I think, on the moral stakes, it's actually gaming. That is the #1 interest that keeps addicts hooked to their screens. And I'm not trying to get involved with any worries, really, about addiction or anything like that. I think there are ways of tackling that. But video games, and this is the point I'm really trying to make, is they are very, very engaging. They are a very engaging, rewarding stimulus. And when players view images from internet games, you see similar neural activities as when addicts of drugs or gambling view images of cues that remind them of their addiction. And if you apply diagnostic criteria to internet use, gaming use, then you find in the UK, one study showed in '98 that 1 in 5 teens were addicted to gaming. All very controversial stuff, whether you can apply those mental health criteria to gaming. But the point I'm trying to make really is that they are a very special influence. You see that from the behavior. And this special influence actually has 2 sides to it. Yes, there's a health and well-being issue, but there's also a huge potential here for education. And I get invited to different conferences, and I sense that this is a conference where I should be talking about the educational side. Next week, I'm going to be at a conference where I'm expected to talk about the health and well-being side, but I'm getting a bit fed up with this because I feel like making this point as clearly as I can. The same neural processes are involved, and I think we have to start thinking about the scientific processes behind it. It's like nuclear fission, for example. Nuclear fission can be used to make nuclear bombs, or it can be used to produce nuclear power. There is a good use and a bad use of that type of technology. And the same is true with gaming. We have a light side and we have a dark side, as illustrated here by Stewie and Chris, I think. So before I leave health and well-being, if you're interested in knowing more about the health aspects of technology, I would point you towards Dan, who might have the report. But I brought out this book with my partner because I realized that there is it is quite a difficult job in some senses, taking the neuroscience and then as a parent trying to use that to generate strategies and guidelines as to what you should do as a parent with your family. So with my 5 children here, who range from 5 to 16, the immediate thing I wanted to do once I'd read this research was to think about how I was going to apply it in my home. And I've written this book with my partner. If you're interested, go to lulu.com and grab yourself a copy. So let's go back to games and education. Michael Gove said recently, when children need to solve equations in order to get more ammo to shoot the aliens, it's amazing how quickly they can learn. Immediately, somebody from a more established gaming institute said, great, but what about exploration, experimentation, team building, problem solving, independent, personalized, differentiated experiences, all these other facets which we think might be very important for what makes a good educational game. But it's only recently, and I think some of this criticism is still ongoing, there's a sense in which much of this learning game activity has been something of a failure. So into this context, let's see if neuroscience can actually shed any light on things. If you're interested in motivation and the thing that makes us engaged when we come across something we find interesting, then there's one part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is particularly interesting. The amount of dopamine uptake in the nucleus accumbens is proportional, that's the little bit there, number there, that is proportional to the amount that you desire something. Okay? And we're talking about a very visceral type of motivation here. Yes, I realize that educational motivation is often more about deferred gratification. It's about longer-term goals. It's the fact that you want to please your parents. It might be about the fact that you want to become a doctor. You're inspired by somebody. All of that is very important. I'm actually talking about a very visceral type of motivation, which I also think is important in the classroom, or could be. And it's the same type of motivation that that cat is experiencing there when it's looking at the goldfish. I don't think that's about exploration, experimentation. I don't think it's about feline identity, building a community of practice. I actually think it's about the activity in the motivation system of the brain, and it's to do with that cat's nucleus accumbens. What we find, I'm moving from cats to monkeys now, what we find in this particular experiment is we are measuring the monkey's dopamine response when it looks at different visual patterns. And we find in this experiment here that the pattern is coming on here, and then sometime later this monkey is going to get possibly a reward. Sometimes this pattern here is 100% associated historically with it getting that little drop of honey, which is a reward. And when it sees one of those patterns, as soon as it sees the pattern, it gets a spike of dopamine. And actually, when the reward actually arrives, when the little drop of honey arrives, it doesn't get any dopamine response at all because it's a wholly predictable event. Sometimes it sees patterns it's never seen before or that have never been associated with a reward. When it sees those patterns, then there's no spike of dopamine because it's not expecting anything to happen. But when the reward arrives, yes, there is a spike of dopamine. That's very nice. Thank you. I want that. What's really interesting is when it sees a pattern which 50% of times in the past it's received a reward for, 50% of times it hasn't received a reward for. And then you get a spike of dopamine when you see the pattern, and the dopamine ramps up until the outcome is known. Now, if you integrate over time, that means there's more dopamine sloshing around the reward system for uncertain reward than either wholly predictable reward or wholly unexpected reward. And that may explain why a lot of situations in gaming, and I have to say gambling as well, generate a lot of motivation, a lot of this approach motivation. Now, this reward response is important because dopamine helps orientate our attention. When you see chocolate cake, that dopamine is going to be responding, and that helps orientate your attention towards the chocolate cake. But it also enhances synaptoplasticity. That's the making of connections between neurons. In other words, the basis for learning. And we can now move on from, I hope we can move on from Sorry, I'm confusing myself with too many. I'm sorry. What I was going to say next, actually, this is an extra slide that I added, because a lot of people might say, well, why do we have this? Why do we have this attraction to uncertain reward? It doesn't really make sense. And actually, this is a bit of a mystery, because to often explain something in evolutionary terms, you have to go back to prehistoric practices of hunter-gathering. And actually, foraging behavior can be totally explained by the reward response and modeled by the reward response using neurocomputational modeling without any additional incentive provided by uncertain reward. On the other hand, hunting often means that you have to sustain motivation over a very long period of time, and the outcomes are very, very uncertain. We also find that this mechanism is more present in males than it is in females. So all of that may possibly suggest that our remaining hunters might be able to tell us something about why we are attracted to uncertain reward. And if anybody wants to fund a little expedition to northeast Namibia, then please do see me after the show. And I'm serious about that. But I was saying that reward is very much about learning. Reward can actually promote learning. This is fantastic news, because in the past, we haven't had any relationship between reward and learning. The number of gold stars that you give a child in the classroom does not predict learning. But what we do find is that the brain's response to reward does predict learning. And what we're looking at here, if I dare go back to the laser without getting confused, we've got memory along the bottom, and we've got response of the nucleus accumbens going up the vertical axis. And you can see there's a nice linear relationship. The more the nucleus accumbens is activated, the more you are likely to remember what is going on around you. The actual mechanisms for this is still an aspect of research, but the fact that it exists is really very clear. So this rapid scheduling of uncertain rewards that we find often in video games can help explain two facts. Firstly, why we get such a high midbrain dopamine release in video games, and we do. It has been compared, one scientific study compared it to the amount of release that you get for some psychostimulant drugs, such as methylphenidate, otherwise known as Ritalin, and some amphetamines. So it's a really very, very strong response. And it might also explain why video games are powerful teachers. They don't always teach what we want them to teach, but there is no denying they are very powerful teachers. They can, for example, within a few hours, say about 10 hours, enhance transferable visual motor skills. That's something that scientists have been trying to do for decades and failing, whilst all the time, action video games in children's living rooms have been doing it, and we've only just started noticing. Little wonder, then, that video games have now become the subject of scientific interest. We want to know how they work, because they're working much better than anything we'd designed before to enhance cognitive function. You can even see this enhancement of cognitive function in some types of professions. For example, practice on a Wii will improve your laparoscopic surgery skills. The Israeli Defense Force insist on their pilots playing action video games because it improves their performance in the air. And my personal feeling, having looked at the evidence, is that there is an overwhelming case for assuming and for considering now that violent video games do promote aggressive responses, in the same way as there is an equally convincing argument that pro-social games can produce positive affective responses such as empathy. How on earth could these video games be such effective teachers? Well, probably because of the way in which they affect the reward system in terms of this very rapid schedule. But then you might say, but in school, we also have uncertainty. We don't know if we're going to get the question correct or not. Well, the studies show that as humans, we love 50-50 chances in games. But actually, when it comes to school, we prefer risks of about 87%. It has been measured at around 90%. We like to be fairly certain we're going to get it correct. And that's probably because academic failure has all sorts of implications for social and self-esteem that failure in a game involving chance does not. So this suggests a sort of learning game approach where essentially you're disrupting that sacred reward consistency relationship that we try to promote in schools. You're actually disrupting it by using uncertainty, because that can increase the reward response whilst at the same time protecting self-esteem. First thing we did was a bridging study. We asked children to ask their maths question from Mr. Certain or Mr. Uncertain, Mr. Certain would just give them a point if they got it correct. Mr. Uncertain would toss a coin if they got it correct, and they'd get no points or 2 points, depending on the fall of the coin. And what we found was that in time, over the session, people more and more were choosing Mr. Uncertain, and particularly boys. Yeah, again, it has to be said, although the effect is also there for girls. Why is this true for boys and more so than for girls? Well, this is a picture of brain function, these top pictures here, when males are playing video games, and all the red and yellow spots are areas of the brain which are more active than amongst females. This is young adults playing video games. The green spots are where the female brain is more active, and there aren't any. But down here, this is showing functional connectivity, and again, it's very much dominated by the male spots, showing this greater functional connectivity for playing video games amongst the males, but there is actually one spot here, orbitofrontal cortex, which is quite often associated with emotional decision-making. So it may well be that females actually are playing games with a different set of end goals in mind. This is what we've found in some of our own research. But there's no doubt that the reward system is responding differently. Now, whether that's cultural or whether it's genetic or whatever, that's all up for grabs. Although the theory at the moment is that ovarian hormones around puberty feminize the reward system in girls. So the female reward system actually changes, whereas the boys' system tends to remain more the same. So girls grow up to be women and boys will be boys. There's not enough neuroscience. We didn't have enough neuroscience to be able to apply this in the classroom straight away, so we had to go off and do some of our own studies. And one of the questions we want to know was what happens when you are competing against somebody. We didn't have any information about how the reward system might respond when you're in a competitive game. And unsurprisingly, we found that your reward system basically responds when your competitor has an unexpected failure. Of course, you can learn a lot from your competitors' unexpected failures, but you can also learn a lot from their unexpected successes. But we had no increase in neural activity anywhere in the brain, even at a very low statistical threshold. We still couldn't see anything at all for unexpected successes on behalf of the competitor, which is quite interesting. So, more bridging studies. Questions such as what would it do to the talk in learning? Well, we found that in classes there was this emergence of sport talk where children suddenly, if they failed, because of the uncertainty, they could say it was chance, but if they succeeded, it was because they were just brilliant. And when we were measuring emotional response, which is this little skin conductivity graph here between a gaming and a no gaming condition, what we found was that the learning task actually produced more emotional response when it was set in a gaming context. And the theory is strong enough for us to be able to use it to predict memory during a learning game. So we can model the brain's response and predict when somebody's going to learn or not. Now, we've been using this in classrooms, developing practice with teachers, working with schools in North Wales, where we've now developed a system whereby you can teach subjects entirely through gaming. And we found it to be very popular with the children. We've got very good learning games, and Promethean are now developing a system for commercial use. So in summary, and I've got 5 seconds left, the points I'd like to make are this. Games exert a very special influence on the brain, and we need to take notice of it. Neuroscience can help us understand and exploit this influence in the classroom. And when it comes to teaching and learning through gaming, it requires technology, but it also requires new understanding and new pedagogy. So thank you very much for listening, and may the force be with you.